Here in Kataragama, a small town in southern Sri Lanka, it's time for the evening puja, or ceremony. Kataragama is a place of pilgrimage for both Buddhists and Hindus, and as you can see, it's quite peaceful. However, in the 1970s and 1980s, the Sri Lankan government waged a war against its own youth in towns and villages just like this one across southern Sri Lanka. Tens of thousands of young men and women disappeared, never to be seen again. This video is about the JVP Insurrections. During these videos, I'm going to be telling two stories. The history of the island and how that led to where it is now, alongside the story of my own travels in Sri Lanka in July and August of 2022. The first two videos of this series sketched out the divisions of the island and the history that went from the great Sinhalese civilizations through the colonial period to independence. We also looked at the origins of the split between the island's two biggest ethnic groups, the Sinhalese and the Tamils. But the JVP insurrections weren't about race. In fact, in many ways they are difficult to understand. They are one of the weirdest uprisings that I've heard about anywhere. I'll try my best to explain.
Sri Lanka is a peaceful country and the people are gentle by nature.
Ceylon looks the sort of place that has everything going for it. The government alleged the North Korean embassy in Colombo was providing the guerrillas with propaganda material. The rank and file of the movement is provided by school and university students, teachers and Buddhist monks.
Here in the 1970s, deep in the Sinhalese heartland of southern Sri Lanka, were the stirrings of something big, violent and revolutionary. Between 1948 and 1970, the population of the island had almost doubled to 12.5 million, 2/3 of whom were under 35. The peasants, suffering from landlessness, debt, drought and floods, felt excluded from the potential of independent Ceylon. More and more people were better educated and politically informed, but there weren't enough jobs for them. There were hundreds of thousands of unemployed graduates who looked forward at a society and an economy controlled by their elders and bound up in ties of religion, class and caste. Enter a young man called Rohana Wijeweera, who had studied medicine in the USSR but been expelled for Maoist tendencies and was the founder of an organization called the JVP. By 1970, it had a network inside the universities preaching a rural-based revolution. It promised a solution to the legions of students unable to find jobs, even sweeping up large numbers of young Buddhist bhikkhus who were fed up with the corruption of the religious orders. Many others were from the lower castes who felt ill-represented and neglected by the country's established leftist movements. Unlike the rest of Sri Lanka's political movements, the JVP's leaders didn't come from the elite, and its support base was overwhelmingly rural. But married to this Marxism was the fiery Sinhalese nationalism that had emerged with Dharmapala at the turn of the century that we looked at in the previous video. Wijeweera was proposing to sweep away all of the old order and replace it with a social equality. On the 5th of April 1971, it exploded. Even though the rebels were inexperienced and poorly trained, armed with knives, shotguns and Molotov cocktails, they were able to seize and hold whole areas in the south and center of the country. However, though they were inexperienced, they caught the government off guard. Sri Lanka's army had had no combat experience since World War II. They had to call India for help. Indian boats patrolled the coast and Indian helicopters supported the counteroffensive. But not only was it the Indians, Sri Lanka was on the forefront of the non-aligned movement, the set of states that during the Cold War explicitly avoided aligning with either the Soviets or the West. As such, both sides fell over themselves to lend support. The US and Czechoslovakia, on opposite sides of the Cold War, sent weapons straight away, as did Australia, Egypt, Yugoslavia and Pakistan. Pakistan and India, incidentally, would fight a war between themselves only a few months later. Even the Chinese rejected this plucky little communist insurgency and immediately advanced alone to the Sri Lankan government. The JVP were left friendless. The Sri Lankan government insisted that it was purely a domestic affair without foreign involvement, but they did close down the embassy of North Korea. If you look on Wikipedia, it says the insurrection was supported by North Korea, Albania, Iraq's Ba'ath Party, as well as having diplomatic support from South Yemen. North Korea is the only one that was mentioned in any of the books I read, and following the references on Wikipedia, that looks pretty solid. But I couldn't get very far with the other ones, so I'll leave that up to you to decide. Ultimately, it was poor planning and coordination that ended the first insurgency. A number of the bomb-making units accidentally blew themselves up. After 2 weeks of fighting, the government was back in control of most of the country. So the first JVP insurrection was put down. But what was the cost? The Prime Minister licensed the security services to use any means necessary to put down the insurrection. Between 35,000 and 40,000 young men and women were held without trial for over a year. And the bodies started to turn up everywhere. By the side of the road with heads impaled on stakes, or out on the exact same white beaches that tourists lounge on today. At the end of April, the New York Times reported that the bodies of hundreds of young men and women were floating downriver near Colombo. Soldiers collected them and burnt them. The roundup by the security services scooped up anyone unsavory, troublemakers, junkies, and pimps, along with the insurgents. Anybody could now disappear, licensed by the government. The army and police were allowed to get rid of the bodies without even informing the families that their children had been arrested or killed. And between 10 and 15,000 people disappeared, the vast majority between 15 and 25 years old. And remember, this was almost entirely Sinhalese against Sinhalese. The government simply denied that atrocities had taken place. Global attention was distracted by the ethnic cleansing going on in what was soon to become Bangladesh, where hundreds of thousands of people were being killed, and the coming war between Pakistan and India. And the forces that created the uprising hadn't dissipated at all. The government grabbed more power for itself and became increasingly authoritarian. As Gordon Weiss writes, these Sinhalese revolts also reveal something about the way in which those who govern Sri Lanka wield power and repress memory. As John Gimlette described it, Sri Lanka has never been the same from that moment on. It was the beginning of the Great Amnesia, a time when whole sections of society could vanish without a single memorial, prosecution, or inquiry. And the pressures that created the insurrection hadn't gone away. They would be back 15 years later and be even more vicious.
Although the fighting may be over for the moment, Ceylon's crisis certainly isn't. If economic reforms are not pushed through quickly, Mrs. Bandaranaike could, in a few years' time, be faced with a much stronger challenge to her authority.
I woke up in Matara, one of the many beach towns along the south coast of the island. I was planning to stay for 2 nights, but pretty quickly I decided that one would be enough. Instead, I headed further east. Between Matara and Hambantota, the land transitions from the wet zone to the dry zone, where the only thing that allows the lush farming you can see here is irrigation. Historically, this was a desperately poor area because of a lack of productive agriculture, though it has developed as Sri Lanka has gone from a developing to a middle-income country. It's also the Sinhalese heartland, where so much of the story of the insurrection took place. Because of the financial crisis that Sri Lanka was going through, fuel imports had almost stopped. While I visited Sri Lanka, all public transport, especially buses, were always packed to the brim, and outside each gas station there were long lines. If the station had no gas, people left their vehicles and would come back when there was some. Hambantota is a slightly weird place. It used to be nothing more than a fishing village until it was chosen to be the site of a big new international port, built with Chinese money. It's a weird coincidence that Hambantota just so happens to also be the home district of the Rajapaksa family that has ruled Sri Lanka for most of the previous 15 years. That is, of course, until the very week that I visited the place. A few months earlier, protesters had burnt the Rajapaksa's ancestral home, though they left standing the $210 million Matara Rajapaksa International Airport, which almost nobody uses, and the $8 million 35,000-seat Mahinda Rajapaksa International Cricket Ground, all built, strangely enough, in the little former fishing village of Hambantota. The next morning I was up early to go on a safari. The crown jewel of a Yala National Park safari is to see a leopard, and we were lucky to get a couple of sightings early in the day. All that some people see is a silhouette from a distance, like this. Elephants have always been important in Sri Lanka. When the Portuguese came, they brought the first Sri Lankan elephant to Europe, where they fed it on cake. It died of dyspepsia and is buried in the Vatican Gardens. There are now 6,000 or more wild elephants on the island, of which only a third live in national parks. In almost half of the island, elephants and people live close to each other. In an average year, between 200 and 250 elephants are killed by people, though that has climbed even higher recently. Human deaths have been rising as well. In 2019, 114 people were killed by elephants. Elephants have learnt to ignore more traditional methods of scaring them away, like shouting, throwing stones, or firecrackers, which are subsidized for farmers by the government. They evade electric fences by uprooting trees and laying them on the wires. Recently, it has become more common for villagers, trying to stop their crops being eaten, to illegally shoot them, or put explosives inside pumpkins which blow apart the elephants' mouths, leading them to die of starvation. One villager even rigged a fence to the electricity mains, killing an elephant. Moving elephants to national parks hasn't worked so far, as often they just decide to return home. Recently, the Minister of Wildlife was the former commander of the Sri Lankan army during the Civil War, and called for bringing in the military to resolve the elephant problem. There was quite a lot of chasing other vehicles and jockeying for position. I was told that it was a great time to visit Yala National Park because there weren't many other people visiting due to the crisis. For me, this was right at the limit of what was bearable, so in normal times it is probably pretty awful. Though I have to admit that racing around was genuinely good fun, and it didn't seem like the leopards were too bothered by us. They slept through most of it. That evening, I got back to my hotel to word that the president had fled the country.
President Gotabaya Rajapaksa fled the country early on Wednesday. He boarded a plane for the Maldives, as protesters refused to leave the streets.
So the first JVP insurrection ended in 1971. It had been crushed ruthlessly, but the conditions that gave rise to it hadn't changed. Wijeweera, the leader of the JVP, was actually freed from prison and contested the 1982 presidential elections, but came a humiliating fourth. The JVP had continued to evolve and had strayed some distance from its Marxist origins, and was becoming increasingly nationalistic, now built around a pretty eccentric ideology. Wijeweera was promising to return the Sinhalese nation to a pre-colonial golden age. Every building above 2 stories high would be pulled down, and Sri Lanka was going to return to a simple life of traditional agriculture and Buddhist worship. The rich were the enemies, as were foreign charities like Save the Children. For the JVP supporters, everything about the prevailing order was wrong, and they were going to sweep it away. Some would see this as the apotheosis of the back-to-basics Sinhalese nationalism of Dharmapala that we looked at in the last video. For a whole new generation of Sinhalese, it was thrilling. And by the end of 1987, almost half of the South was behind them, and this time they were much better prepared. Now, we're not going to go into detail about this until the next video, but in 1987, a peacekeeping force from India arrived in the north of the island to intervene in the now raging conflict between Tamil insurgents and the Sri Lankan army. This agreement between the governments that put Indian boots on Sri Lankan soil was the spark, and the second JVP uprising exploded. Unlike in 1971, there was no gradual escalation. They just unleashed an overwhelming wave of horror. It was a pogrom by night. The killers were never seen and the dead were found in the morning. In 3 months, the JVP assassinated more than 70 members of parliament and political functionaries. They also targeted administrators, policemen, soldiers, members of the ruling party, and even senior monks that were close to the government. In 1988, they gunned down Sri Lanka's biggest film star, who was the leader of a progressive political party, in front of his home, in front of his children. An offshoot of the JVP even attempted assassinations of the Prime Minister and President. What was so terrifying is just how far they had infiltrated the government, civil service, and security forces. Impossible to identify, there was assassination after assassination. But it wasn't just the political leaders. The JVP declared general strikes and enforced them by simply executing the ordinary shopkeepers or bus drivers who turned up for work. On average, 25 people were assassinated every night. On the worst day, 21st December of 1988, 200 people were killed. More than 8,000 civilians will be liquidated over the course of the insurgency, more than 100 politicians and 62 academics. At the University of Kandy, 12 severed heads were arranged around the campus pond. This insurgent group was paralyzing the economy, demonstrating the helplessness of the government, each strike seemingly bringing the country closer to collapse. The government lost control of large areas of the south where taxes were abolished, prisons were opened, and hotels were closed. In these areas, you could be killed by the JVP for reading a government newspaper, and the doctors had to work for nothing. And out of this chaos and instability came the response. With the Indians taking over the struggle with the Tamils in the north, the Sri Lankan army was free to deal with the insurgency in the south. The Indian Air Force airlifted thousands of Sri Lankan troops from the Jaffna Peninsula to the Sinhalese southern heartland. And just like in 1971, the world was distracted. In 1987 and 1988, the Soviets were pulling out of Afghanistan, and the Eastern Bloc was unraveling. The first Palestinian Intifada had begun, and there was a presidential election in the US. Also, it wasn't just the police and the army, but a whole range of government-supported paramilitary groups that fanned out across the countryside through the villages and towns, looking for suspected JVP activists or sympathizers. "We cannot treat them as humans," the president said. It was a campaign of terror to match that of the JVP. They delivered executions, disappearance, and lynchings, and, just like the JVP, they worked at night. University students, one of the groups most sympathetic to the JVP movement, were snatched from their dormitories and pulled off the streets. Sri Lanka's universities were closed for a full 3 years. People were pulled into windowless white vans, which became infamous and terrifying. This was the Bisha Nikalaya, or the time of great fear. The soldiers knew where to find the insurgents because they were themselves from these rural southern communities. Whole classrooms of children were shot or hacked to death in the fields. Bodies would be hung on the lampposts with signs around their necks, or, again, beheaded with their skulls stuck on posts in the public square. By July 1989, the counter-killings had reached up to 1,000 lives a day. Organizations like Amnesty International rang the alarm and were ignored. When tiny Sri Lanka was paid any attention in the international news, it was about the Indian peacekeeping force in the north. Nobody was there to care for the thousands of Sinhalese youth who were murdered by their government in the paddy fields and on the pristine beaches where tourists flocked. The killing continued until 1990, though the real threat had been snuffed out after 2 years of insurrection. In 1989, Widjawara was captured. He had been hiding as a tea planter up in the hills. He was interrogated for a day, made to film an appeal for his followers to lay down their arms, and then taken to the 8th tee of the Royal Colombo Golf Club, where he was shot while attempting to escape. At the end of it, how many were killed? I've seen 30,000 on the low end and 60,000 on the high end. Most of them civilians, almost all of them young, killed without trial simply on suspicion of being JVP members or sympathizers, or just members of the opposition party. And nobody was ever brought to account. There was no Truth and Reconciliation Commission. For many people, the white vans into which so many thousands of people disappeared are still out there. It was all over. The government won. The insurrection was extinguished. And the weird thing is, the JVP is still around in Parliament today, but it's continued evolving away from a Sinhalese extremist group to an ultranationalist party that supported the army during Sri Lanka's next conflict, to now a party that campaigns on transparency and clean government. There have been government-appointed inquiries in the years since, but practically zero prosecutions. Not a single leader or person who gave the orders for this terror has been held to account. There's no memorial and people don't talk about it. There just hasn't been a reckoning with the past. According to Gordon Weiss, the uprisings represent a dark truth about Sri Lanka, despite its spectacular natural beauty and how peaceful it seems. The business of state and the social fabric of Sri Lankan affairs in general are shrouded in a tension of unresolved violence. There is a pervasive sense of guilt, coated by a collective apathy born of the effort to forget. Unpunished murderers in palm-fringed villages share the streets with the families of their victims and have done so for decades. He's not the only writer to share similar sentiments, that this was a turning point and representative of something larger. And when I shared this with some of my Sri Lankan friends I met on my travels, they saw it the same way. And while all that was going on, a young Sinhalese parliamentarian was walking the corridors of the United Nations in Geneva. He was known as a human rights activist and had appeared in front of the UN's Human Rights Council, pleading for the world to pay attention and stop the slaughter of his people. His name was Mahinda Rajapaksa, and in the next 2 videos we're going to get to know this man a lot better, because as bad and as brutal as the JVP insurrections were, the main event was just getting started. The Sri Lankan Civil War.
පන්සලේ හිටිය මගේ සහෝදරයෙක් පඤ්ඤානන්ද කියලා දික්කල්ලේ. ඒ පඤ්ඤානන්ද හාමුදුරුවෝ ඕනම දෙයකට හිනහ වෙනවා. JVP කාර්යය ඇවිල්ලා හාමුදුරුවෝ පොලිසියට උත්තර දුන්නා නේද? කටඋත්තර දුන්නා නේද? කේලම් කිව්වා නේද? ඉතින් මේ හැමදාම මෙහෙ වෙන හන්ද හාමුදුරුවන්ගේ කටට වෙඩි තියලා මරලා දැම්මා.
දැන් මෙහි ওই ජනතා විමුක්ති පෙරමුණේ සාමාන්‍ය නායකයෙක් හිටපු එයයි මරලා ගෙනල්ලා තියෙනවත් දැක්කා. මේ උරුබොක පොලිසිය.
දැන් කැකන දුරේ හන්දි 6ක් තිබුණා. වැට්ට ගිහින් එනකොට පුච්චනවා. ඒ පුච්චන්නේ ඉතින් හමුදාන්නේ දාලා පුච්චන්නේ ඉතින් හුඟදුවට ටයර් දාලා
ජීපී කාර්යුන්ගේ මේ උළු ගෙඩි ගෙනල්ලා ගැහුවා මේ හන්දි.
දැන් මාත් එක්ක වැඩ කරපු අපේ ඩිපෝ එකේ එක්කෙනෙක් මේ මුළු පවුලම පික්කුවනේ.
ඉතින් සිංහලයම මරුවනේ. ඇතගෙන ගිහිල්ලා. එතකොට ඉතින් දෙක ಜಾති බෙදයක් නෑ. මරලා කියන අදටත් නෑ අතුරුදහන්. එයාට වෙච්ච දෙයක් නෑ. දැන් මෙතන
ඒක ඉතින් ඉස්මුදුනින් පිළිගත්තේ නමුත් අපේ අර සිංහල ජාතියේ පොඩි කොහේ හරි වරදක් නිසා අද ඒක මිනිස්සුන්ට අමතක වෙලා තියෙනවා. ඒ තත්ත්වය අදත් නැති වෙන්නේ නැහනේ අදත් තියෙනවා.